One day before my wedding, my father called me with a message that shattered the room. "I am not walking you down the aisle. Your sister says it would upset her." My mother chimed in from the background, telling me to just walk alone, because it is not a big deal. On my wedding day, I did not walk alone. When the heavy church doors opened and the guests saw who was holding my arm, the entire room gasped. My father, sitting in the front row, went completely pale. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that underestimated your worth. I am Morgan. I am 29 years old. Growing up as a Black family in a highly exclusive neighborhood in Atlanta meant we had to maintain a flawless image at all times. My father Warren built a massive logistics company, and my mother Brenda lived for her high society church committee meetings and elite country club dinners. But behind the custom mahogany doors of our sprawling estate, I was the invisible child. My older sister Vanessa was the golden girl. She was always the priority. When Vanessa married Preston, a white man from a supposedly prestigious old money family, my parents practically worshipped the ground they walked on. I was just the quiet younger sister who moved away to New York. It was exactly 24 hours before my wedding. I was standing in the center of the luxurious bridal suite at the Four Seasons, surrounded by layers of heavy ivory silk. The master seamstress was kneeling beside me, making the absolute final adjustments to the hem of my custom gown. The room smelled of fresh roses and expensive perfume. My phone buzzed on the vanity mirror table. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I smiled warmly and answered the call, fully expecting him to ask about the rehearsal dinner schedule or to confirm the arrival time for the photographer. Instead, his voice came through the speaker, sounding incredibly cold and entirely detached. "Morgan, we have a situation," he said. There was no greeting. There was no warmth. "I will not be able to walk you down the aisle tomorrow." I froze completely. The seamstress looked up at me, her hands hovering over the delicate lace. I asked him what he meant, assuming there was a medical emergency or a sudden flight delay. "Vanessa is in absolute pieces right now." My father explained, his tone laced with heavy irritation, as if I were the one inconveniencing his day. "She and Preston had a massive argument this morning. Preston is extremely stressed about his commercial real estate deals, and Vanessa is having a complete mental breakdown over their marriage. She just told us that watching you parade around a church in a white dress, acting like you have the perfect life, will completely destroy her mental health. We cannot put her through that trauma." I stared directly at my own reflection in the mirror. My own father was abandoning me on my wedding day because my 33-year-old sister was jealous of my happiness. Vanessa had always been exactly like this. Whenever I had a moment to shine, whether it was my college graduation or my first promotion, she manufactured a dramatic crisis to steal the attention back to herself. And my parents always eagerly catered to her tantrums. Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of his rejection, my mother Brenda snatched the phone from him. "Listen to me, Morgan," she barked loudly into the receiver. "You need to be mature and sensible about this situation. We absolutely cannot leave your sister alone in this fragile state. You and Julian can just walk down the aisle together, or you can simply walk alone. It is the modern era. Nobody cares about the father giving the bride away anymore anyway." I took a very slow, deep breath. I asked my mother if she realized exactly what she was saying to me. I asked if my wedding day could be about me for just one single minute of her life. My mother scoffed loudly, a sound full of pure disdain. "Do not be so selfish, Morgan. Next week, I have to attend a massive political fundraising gala with Preston and his prominent family. They are old money. They are important connections for your father's business. If Vanessa shows up to that gala with swollen eyes because she cried all weekend over your wedding, it will completely ruin our family image. Just walk by yourself. We will see you at the reception for dinner." They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for their presence. For 29 long years, I had begged for their scraps of affection and validation. But standing in that bright bridal suite, something inside my chest finally snapped. The deep sadness evaporated instantly, replaced by a freezing, calculated clarity. "Okay," I said evenly. My voice did not shake at all. "Stay with Vanessa. I will see you tomorrow." I ended the call before they could utter another word. The seamstress gently asked if I needed a moment alone. I told her with a bright smile that I was perfectly fine. I stepped out of the wedding dress, tipped her very generously, and sat down on the velvet sofa. My fiancé Julian walked into the suite a few minutes later. Julian was a brilliant corporate mergers and acquisitions lawyer. He took one look at my face and knew exactly that something had gone terribly wrong. He sat next to me and gently held my hand. I told him my father was refusing to walk me down the aisle to comfort Vanessa. Julian did not offer empty emotional platitudes. He knew my family history. He simply looked into my eyes and asked me what I wanted to do next. I pulled out my phone and scrolled down to a contact saved only as Calvin. I had kept my professional life completely hidden from my toxic family for years. They sincerely thought I was a low-level data analyst, struggling to pay rent in New York. They had no idea that I was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and successful private equity firms on Wall Street. And they certainly had no idea who my mentor and business partner truly was. Calvin was not just an investor. He was the original founder of my father's logistics company, the man my father had betrayed and sent to prison 30 years ago to steal his empire. We had spent the last 5 years quietly buying up every single toxic loan my father and Preston had taken out to fund their luxurious lifestyles. I pressed dial. The man answered on the second ring. "Calvin," I said, my voice steady and completely cold. "My father just pulled out of the wedding to comfort Vanessa. It is time." Calvin chuckled on the other end of the line. It was a deep, resonant, and powerful sound that carried decades of patience. "I will be on the next private flight to Atlanta, Morgan. Consider the acquisition initiated. I look forward to walking my real daughter down the aisle." I hung up the phone and looked back at Julian. He smiled a sharp, knowing smile. My parents and my sister thought they were leaving me alone and humiliated. They thought I was weak and defenseless. They had absolutely no idea that my single phone call had just authorized a $45 million hostile takeover of my father's entire logistics empire. They wanted to protect their precious public image and their deeply flawed golden child. I was going to systematically take everything they owned. Julian watched me place the phone down on the vanity table. He did not look shocked or intimidated by the $45 million movie I had just initiated. Instead, he reached out and poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, handing one to me. He asked me if I felt any guilt about what was going to happen tomorrow. I took a sip of the cold water and looked at the intricate lace of my wedding dress draped over the velvet chair. I told him that guilt was a luxury my family had burned out of me a very long time ago. Julian knew everything about my past, but sitting in that quiet hotel room, the memories felt heavier than usual. I reminded him of my high school graduation. I had been named valedictorian and secured a full-ride scholarship to Columbia University. It was supposed to be the proudest day of my life, but on that exact morning, Vanessa deliberately backed her car into the garage door, claiming she was having a severe panic attack about her own college grades. My parents skipped my graduation ceremony entirely to sit with Vanessa at the house and calm her fragile nerves. When I came home holding my diploma, my mother scolded me for smiling too brightly while my sister was in distress. My father then demanded I give Vanessa the small savings I had accumulated from my part-time job so she could buy a new car to feel better about herself. They told me I was being selfish for wanting to keep my own money when I already had a free ride to college. That was the exact day I realized my family did not see me as a person. They saw me as a resource to be extracted and a dull background to make Vanessa look brighter. Julian nodded slowly, listening to every word. He had spent the last 3 years helping me untangle the massive web of financial fraud my father and Preston had created. Julian explained the legal mechanics of it all when we first started investigating their accounts. Preston was supposedly the heir to an old money real estate empire. My parents paraded him around Atlanta like royalty, boasting about his pedigree to anyone who would listen at their country club. But Julian discovered through his corporate law network that Preston was essentially broke. His family had lost their generational wealth decades ago. Preston was funding his lavish lifestyle with reckless commercial loans and high-interest debt. The worst part was that my father, Warren, had secretly used his logistics company as collateral to back Preston's failing investments. My father was so obsessed with being associated with white old money that he risked the entire legacy of a successful black-owned business just to keep up appearances and keep Vanessa happy. This is where Calvin came into the picture. Calvin was the brilliant mind who actually built the logistics company from the ground up back in the late 80s. My father was just his ambitious accountant. When the company started turning a massive profit, my father framed Calvin for corporate embezzlement. My father falsified financial records, paid off key witnesses, and sent Calvin to federal prison for 10 long years. My father stole the company, the distribution patents, and the wealth that should have belonged to Calvin's family. I met Calvin by pure chance during my first year working at the private equity firm in New York. He had rebuilt his life from absolutely nothing and had become a quiet titan in the investment world. When he realized who my father was, he did not seek revenge against me. Instead, he became my true mentor. He saw my talent, my relentless drive, and my deep, unhealed pain. Together, we formed a silent partnership. Calvin provided the massive capital, and I provided the inside knowledge of my father's reckless financial habits. For 5 years, we quietly tracked every single loan my father and Preston took out. Whenever a traditional bank rejected their desperate attempts to refinance their massive debts, our firm stepped in through anonymous shell companies and bought the debt. We owned the mortgage on my parents' sprawling mansion. We owned the leases on their luxury vehicles. We owned every single asset tied to the logistics company, and they had absolutely no idea who held their leash. Julian gently touched my shoulder, pulling me out of the dark memories. He told me that the final paperwork had already cleared the global banking system. The $45 million debt acquisition was now officially locked in stone. If my father and Preston failed to produce the cash by Monday morning, all of their assets would be legally seized by our firm. I felt a deep sense of profound calm wash over me. My mother wanted me to walk alone to spare Vanessa from feeling inadequate. They wanted me to feel small and abandoned on the most important day of my life. But they were the ones who were truly abandoned. They were living in a fragile paper castle built on stolen money and desperate lies. I looked at Julian and told him that tomorrow would be a beautiful wedding. There would be no tears from me. There would be no begging for my parents' approval. I was going to put on my custom silk gown and I was going to walk down that aisle with the man who actually built the empire my family was currently destroying. Julian kissed my forehead and promised me that he would have all the foreclosure and bankruptcy documents neatly organized in his leather briefcase for the reception. We spent the rest of the evening ordering expensive room service and laughing about our future together. There was no anxiety in my heart. There was only the quiet anticipation of absolute justice. When the sun rose the next morning, the sky over Atlanta was a brilliant, clear blue. The wedding day had officially arrived. I stood in front of the tall mirror as the makeup artist applied the final elegant touches to my face. My phone remained completely silent on the table. There were no good morning texts from my mother. There were no apologies from my father. There was only heavy silence from the people who were supposed to love me the most. I did not care anymore. I slipped into my wedding dress and the heavy ivory silk flowed perfectly around me. I stepped into my heels and took a deep breath. The private town car arrived at the hotel to take me to the historic church downtown. As I sat in the back of the car watching the busy city streets roll by, I felt a profound sense of ultimate freedom. The little girl who used to cry in her pale blue bedroom was gone forever. Today, I was going to bury the toxic legacy of my family and take back everything they had stolen. The church was magnificent. Tall stained glass windows cast colorful light across the stone steps. I could hear the faint sound of the string quartet playing inside the sanctuary. My wedding coordinator met me at the side entrance, looking slightly panicked. She whispered that my parents were already seated in the front row, and that my father had stubbornly confirmed he was not participating in the processional. She asked me if I wanted to delay the ceremony to talk to them and change his mind. I smiled at her calmly and said there was absolutely no need for a delay. I told her the man walking me down the aisle was already here. Just as I spoke, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. The heavy door opened and Calvin stepped out. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored suit. His presence commanded immediate respect from everyone around him. He walked up the stone steps, his eyes shining with profound pride. He took my hands in his and told me I looked absolutely beautiful. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were tears of pure joy. I linked my arms securely through his. The heavy wooden doors of the church stood before us. The music began to swell loudly. It was time to show my family exactly who they had thrown away. Inside the main sanctuary of the historic Atlanta church, the atmosphere was thick with wealthy expectations. The soaring vaulted ceilings echoed with the soft sounds of a live string quartet. Elaborate floral arrangements of white orchids and trailing green ivy cascaded down the aisles, creating a picture-perfect scene. My fiancé Julian stood at the altar looking incredibly handsome and perfectly calm. The pews were filled with 300 of Atlanta's most elite socialites, corporate executives, and influential family friends. But the real spectacle was happening in the very front row on my family side. My wedding coordinator had peeked through the side doors and relayed every single detail to me later, but even without her play-by-play, I knew exactly how my family made their grand entrance. My father Warren and my mother Brenda walked down the center aisle, completely ignoring the standard wedding protocol. The parents of the bride should have been in the holding room preparing for the processional. Instead, Warren wore a custom tuxedo and strutted down the aisle, projecting the image of a flawless, self-made patriarch. Brenda clung to his arm, wearing a heavy silver beaded gown, flashing her massive diamond rings at the elite church committee members she passed. They took their seats in the front row with extreme arrogance. They were completely unbothered by the fact that they had just abandoned their youngest daughter on the most important day of her life. Right behind them came Vanessa and Preston. Vanessa had truly outdone herself in her endless, desperate quest for attention. She was wearing a floor-length white silk gown. It was not a subtle cream or a soft pastel ivory. It was pure, blinding bridal white. The dress featured a plunging neckline and a dramatic high slit down the leg. It was a deliberate and extremely hostile choice designed to confuse the guests and humiliate me. She wanted everyone in the building to whisper about her. She wanted the guests to look at her and wonder why the sister of the bride looked more like a bride than the actual bride herself. She walked slowly down the aisle with a massive, arrogant smirk on her face, pausing to air kiss several of my mother's wealthy friends. Vanessa was practically glowing with toxic satisfaction. She truly believed she had won the ultimate victory. She had successfully thrown a tantrum, forced our father to abandon me, and now she was wearing white to my wedding. In her twisted mind, she was the absolute center of the universe, and I was just an extra in her movie. But while Vanessa was busy soaking in the confused and judging stares of the congregation, her husband Preston was quietly falling apart at the seams. Preston was supposed to be the confident, untouchable heir to an old money real estate fortune. He was supposed to be the golden white son-in-law that my parents constantly bragged about. But as he sat down in the polished wooden pew, he was sweating profusely. The climate control inside the grand church was perfectly cool, yet Preston's forehead was slick with nervous perspiration. He kept shifting uncomfortably in his seat, checking the exits like a trapped animal. His hands were visibly shaking as he aggressively tapped the screen of his expensive phone. Preston was not looking at congratulatory messages or reading the wedding program. He was staring at a barrage of automated financial alerts from his offshore bank accounts. The massive high-interest commercial loans he had taken out to fund Vanessa's extreme luxury shopping habits and their fake billionaire lifestyle were officially defaulting. Our private equity firm had spent the entire morning quietly executing the legal takeover, freezing his credit lines one by one. Every time he tried to refresh his banking app, a new red notification appeared showing zero available funds and immediate foreclosure notices. He tried to send a frantic text message to his corporate broker, but the message simply bounced back. His entire financial world was collapsing in real time right there in the front row of the church. He glanced sideways at my father, Warren, hoping to ask for another secret cash bailout. But Warren was too busy smiling proudly at Vanessa, completely unaware that his own massive logistics empire was currently being swallowed whole by the very same hidden debt traps. Unaware of her husband's silent, agonizing panic attack, Vanessa leaned over and whispered something cruel to our mother. Brenda let out a soft, sophisticated laugh and patted Vanessa's hand approvingly. They were actively bonding over my impending humiliation. They were eagerly looking toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the church, waiting for the music to change. They were waiting for the exact moment the doors would open and I would be forced to walk out all alone. They desperately wanted to see my face crumpled in sadness and defeat. They wanted the entire wealthy congregation to pity me. They wanted the high society gossips to whisper about how Morgan must have done something truly terrible to deserve being walked down the aisle by absolutely no one. The guests were already beginning to notice that something was very wrong. The whispers started rippling quietly through the packed pews. People were pointing out that Warren was sitting down instead of waiting in the vestibule with his daughter. They were staring openly at Vanessa's inappropriate white dress. The tension in the room was thick and extremely uncomfortable. Julian's family sat on the opposite side of the aisle, observing my family with silent, polite disgust. Julian's parents knew everything about the emotional abuse I had suffered over the years, and they watched my mother and sister with cold, calculating eyes. They knew exactly what was about to happen, and they were waiting patiently for the hammer to drop. As the final soft notes of the string prelude echoed through the massive church, Warren confidently crossed his legs and checked his heavy gold Rolex watch. He leaned back in the wooden pew, looking like a proud king sitting on a throne. He was so certain of his total power over me. He was so incredibly certain that I was just a weak little girl who would simply accept the massive disrespect and walk down the aisle with my head bowed in total shame. The string quartet suddenly stopped playing. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the entire room. 300 guests turned their heads toward the back of the sanctuary. Vanessa sat up perfectly straight, smoothing her white silk dress, preparing to steal the spotlight the moment I appeared alone and broken. Preston wiped the sweat from his pale face and shoved his phone deep into his pocket, trying desperately to compose himself. Brenda smiled a cruel little smile. The grand pipe organ began to play the powerful opening chords of the bridal chorus. The heavy wooden doors slowly began to creak open. My family stared directly at the doorway, their arrogant smirks firmly planted on their faces, completely ready to consume my pain. The heavy wooden doors swung open completely, letting a brilliant beam of afternoon sunlight flood the back of the sanctuary. The grand pipe organ hit the highest, most triumphant note of the bridal chorus, vibrating through the stone floors. I stepped over the threshold into the massive church. But I was not walking alone. I was not crying. My head was not bowed in shame. My arm was tightly and proudly linked with Calvin's. A collective gasp rippled through the 300 guests. It was a loud, undeniable sound of pure shock. Calvin walked beside me with the slow, measured steps of a man who owned everything he looked at. He was a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man in his late 60s, radiating an aura of absolute authority. His custom black suit was perfectly tailored over a crisp white shirt, contrasting with his silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He did not look like a sympathetic uncle stepping in at the last minute. He looked like a titan of industry. He looked like a king making his entrance. The arrogant smirks on my family's faces melted away in less than a second. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, but I could see the exact moment my father Warren's entire world shattered. Warren had spent the last 30 years convincing himself that the man he betrayed was gone forever. He had built his fake legacy on the grave of Calvin's career. As Calvin stepped fully into the light, Warren's confident posture completely collapsed. The smug patriarch, who had just been checking his heavy gold watch, suddenly looked like a terrified old man. All the blood violently drained from Warren's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale green color. His jaw literally dropped open. His hands, which had been resting comfortably on the wooden pew, suddenly gripped the polished wood so hard his knuckles turned white. He stopped breathing. The ghost of his past, the man he had framed and sent to federal prison to rot, was currently walking his youngest daughter down the aisle. Beside him, Preston was having an entirely different but equally devastating realization. Preston had never met Calvin in person during the early logistics company days, but Preston was intimately familiar with Calvin's face. As the desperate heir to a bankrupt real estate portfolio, Preston spent his nights frantically researching the private equity firm that was aggressively buying up all of his massive debts. He knew exactly who the chairman of the board was. He had seen Calvin's portrait on corporate dossiers and financial websites. Preston recognized the billionaire who currently held the power to destroy his entire life with a single signature. As we took our first few steps down the long white aisle, Preston's reaction was visceral and immediate. He let out a choked, gasping sound. His expensive phone slipped from his sweaty fingers and clattered loudly onto the stone floor of the church, but he did not even try to reach down and pick it up. Preston began to physically shake. His shoulders trembled under his tailored jacket, and his knees knocked together so violently he had to brace himself against the pew in front of him. He realized in that exact moment that his sister-in-law, the quiet girl his wife constantly belittled, was somehow directly connected to the ruthless Wall Street titan who owned all of his debt. The sheer terror in Preston's wide blue eyes was absolutely intoxicating to witness. Brenda and Vanessa, however, were completely confused. They did not recognize Calvin. Brenda squinted her eyes, trying to figure out which country club member or church elder I had managed to drag out of the crowd to save myself from embarrassment. When she realized she did not know the powerful billionaire walking beside me, her face twisted in deep aristocratic offense. Vanessa was furious for an entirely different reason. Vanessa had worn her completely inappropriate white silk dress to steal the attention of the crowd. But right now, not a single person in that massive church was looking at her. Every single eye, every single camera lens, and every single whispered conversation was entirely focused on me and Calvin. Vanessa's desperate attempt to ruin my day was completely overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of Calvin's presence. We walked down the long aisle with beautiful, deliberate precision. The string quartet accompanied the organ, creating a magnificent soundtrack for my ultimate victory. Every step we took felt like a hammer striking the final nails into my family's toxic coffin. I could hear the elite guests whispering frantically to each other, asking who the incredibly distinguished gentleman was. I felt Calvin's arms strong and steady beneath my hand. For the first time in my 29 years of life, I actually felt protected. I felt like I had a real father walking beside me, a man who valued my intelligence and my heart instead of treating me like a disposable accessory. As we reached the halfway point of the aisle, Calvin slowly turned his head and locked eyes directly with my father. The distance between them was only about 20 feet now. Warren shrank back into his seat, looking as though he wanted the floor of the church to open up and swallow him whole. Calvin did not sneer. He did not glare. He simply gave Warren a very slow, extremely cold nod of recognition. It was the nod of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey after decades of patient stalking. Warren visibly swallowed hard, pulling at the tight collar of his tuxedo shirt, as if he were suddenly suffocating in the perfectly air-conditioned room. Preston was now hyperventilating quietly beside Vanessa. Vanessa hissed at him to stop shaking and act normal, but Preston could not hear her. His mind was entirely consumed by the flashing zero balances on his banking app and the terrifying reality that the architect of his financial ruin was currently escorting the bride to the altar. We finally reached the end of the aisle. Julian stood waiting for me with a brilliant, knowing smile on his handsome face. The altar was decorated with hundreds of white roses, but nothing in the room was as beautiful as the absolute terror radiating from the front row. Calvin gently placed my hand into Julian's hand. The traditional protocol meant Calvin was supposed to quietly retreat to the back of the church or take a seat in the secondary pews. But Calvin had no intention of doing that. He had flown on a private jet to Atlanta for a very specific reason, and he was going to execute every single part of our plan with flawless precision. Calvin stopped at the edge of the altar. He turned to face me and placed a warm fatherly kiss on my cheek. He took my hand and gently placed it into Julian's waiting hand. The pastor smiled warmly at us, completely unaware of the massive corporate warfare unfolding just a few feet away. The traditional protocol dictated that the person giving the bride away should step back and take a seat in the second or third row. But Calvin did not step back. Instead, he turned around and walked directly toward the front pew where my family was sitting. Warren watched him approach with wide, terrified eyes. The pew was already slightly crowded with Brenda, Vanessa, and Preston, but Calvin did not care. He stepped right up to the polished wooden bench and stared down at my father. The silence between them was heavy and lethal. Warren scrambled to slide over, practically crushing Brenda's expensive silver-beaded gown to make room. Calvin sat down slowly, smoothing the crease of his custom trousers. He was now sitting shoulder to shoulder with the man who had stolen his entire life 30 years ago. The pastor began speaking, his voice echoing beautifully through the historic sanctuary. He talked about love and patience and the enduring strength of a true partnership. Julian held both of my hands, looking deeply into my eyes. It was a beautiful moment, and I felt a genuine wave of overwhelming love for the man standing across from me. But even as I focused on Julian's comforting presence, I was acutely aware of the devastating psychological torture happening right behind me. The church was perfectly silent except for the pastor's voice. Calvin leaned over very slowly until his mouth was just inches from Warren's ear. Calvin did not yell. He did not make a scene. He spoke in a low, steady whisper that carried the weight of a 30-year grudge. "You kept the company running decently for a while, Warren," Calvin whispered, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead on the altar. "But you got greedy. You leveraged the regional distribution centers to pay for this fake lifestyle. You took out high-interest mezzanine debt against the primary logistics hubs. Did you really think no one would notice when those notes matured?" I could not see Warren's face, but I could hear the sharp intake of his breath. Warren sat completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the cross above the altar. He was trapped in the front row of a crowded church, unable to scream, unable to run away, and unable to defend himself. Calvin continued his quiet surgical dismantling of my father's ego. "I bought it all, Warren," Calvin murmured, his voice smooth and deadly. "I bought the commercial mortgages on the Atlanta warehouses. I bought the equipment leases for the entire trucking fleet. I even bought the secondary mortgage on that massive, ridiculous house you are currently living in. You do not own a single brick of that empire anymore. I do. And starting Monday morning, you are going to be locked out of the corporate offices you stole from me." Brenda leaned forward slightly, trying to hear what the distinguished billionaire was whispering to her husband. She still did not know who Calvin was. She simply saw an incredibly wealthy man talking to Warren and assumed it was some high-level business networking. She smiled politely at Calvin, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently homeless. Vanessa was too busy fuming over her ruined spotlight to notice the dynamic between the two men. She kept aggressively smoothing the fabric of her white silk dress, glaring at the back of my head. She was already plotting how she would humiliate me at the reception to regain her status as the center of attention. She had no idea that her trust fund had vanished into thin air. But Preston knew. Preston was sitting on the other side of Vanessa, staring at Calvin with absolute horror. Preston had finally connected the dots. He realized that if this ruthless private equity chairman had come for Warren's logistics company, he had absolutely come for Preston's fake real estate portfolio, too. Preston buried his face in his hands, pretending to be moved by the wedding ceremony, but his shoulders were heaving with silent, panicked sobs. Julian and I began to recite our vows. Julian promised to protect me, to stand by me, and to build a real family with me. I promised to do the same for him. My voice did not shake. I felt incredibly strong. I was marrying my best friend, and I was actively destroying the people who had abused me my entire life. It was the most perfect day I could have ever imagined. The pastor pronounced us husband and wife. Julian leaned in and kissed me deeply. The entire congregation erupted into loud, joyful applause. The grand pipe organ swelled, playing a triumphant recessional march. Julian and I turned to face the crowd, our fingers tightly interlaced. As we began our walk back up the aisle, I finally allowed myself to look directly at the front row. Warren looked like a hollow shell of a man. His skin was gray and his eyes were completely vacant. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 20 minutes. Calvin was sitting next to him, clapping politely with a serene, satisfied smile on his face. Preston was looking down at the floor, completely broken. Only Brenda and Vanessa were smiling their fake, arrogant smiles, completely blind to the absolute slaughter that had just occurred. We walked out the heavy oak doors and stepped into the bright Atlanta sunlight. The ceremony was officially over. I was a married woman. But the real event was just about to begin. The reception was being held in the massive ballroom of a luxury hotel downtown. My family was going to walk into that ballroom thinking they still held all the power. They were going to try to humiliate me one last time in front of all those elite guests. And I was going to let them dig their own graves before I buried them completely. The tension in the air was electric, and I could not wait for the music to stop. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton downtown. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the gold leaf ceilings, casting a warm, glamorous glow over the hundreds of guests arriving from the church. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated smoothly with silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The jazz band was warming up in the corner, playing soft, elegant melodies that mingled seamlessly with the sophisticated chatter of Atlanta's elite. Julian and I arrived through the private service elevator intended to give us a few moments of peace before we made our grand entrance as a married couple. But my family had other plans. They were completely incapable of letting me experience a single moment of joy without trying to inject their venom into it. Before Julian could even hand me a glass of cold water, my mother Brenda and my sister Vanessa intercepted us in the lavish, carpeted hallway outside the bridal holding suite. Julian stepped forward instinctively to shield me, but I gently placed my hand on his chest and shook my head. I knew exactly what was about to happen, and I needed to face them alone one last time. I told Julian to go inside the ballroom and make sure Calvin had an excellent seat near the front of the stage. Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second, his jaw tight with protective anger, but he saw the absolute certainty in my eyes. He kissed my cheek, cast a cold glare at my mother, and walked away, leaving me alone with the two women who had tormented me for my entire life. The moment Julian was out of sight, Brenda reached out and grabbed my bare arm. Her manicured acrylic nails dug painfully into my skin, leaving small crescent-shaped indentations. She shoved the heavy wooden door of the private room open and violently pulled me inside. Vanessa followed closely behind her white silk dress, hissing aggressively against the thick hotel carpet. Vanessa quickly shut the door behind us and turned the heavy brass lock. The metallic click of the lock echoed loudly in the small soundproof room, instantly cutting off the joyful sounds of the jazz band outside. I barely had time to steady my footing before my mother swung her arm back and slapped me directly across the face. The sharp crack of her hand hitting my cheek was deafening. The physical force of the blow snapped my head to the side. A stinging hot heat immediately blossomed across my skin, spreading from my jawbone all the way up to my temple. It was a heavy, vicious slap meant to punish and degrade me. It was the kind of slap meant to put the disobedient little girl back in her tiny invisible box. "How dare you?" Brenda hissed, her voice trembling with raw, unhinged fury. "How dare you humiliate your father in front of the entire congregation like that? Who was that man you dragged into the church, Morgan? Are you completely out of your mind? You paraded a total stranger down the aisle just to spit in the face of the man who put clothes on your back and fed you for 20 years. You made us look like absolute fools in front of the country club committee. Everyone is out there whispering about us right now because you wanted to throw a childish tantrum." I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not reach up to hold my stinging cheek. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I just stared at her, noting how the heavy stage makeup she wore was beginning to crack around the deep, angry lines of her mouth. She looked old. She looked hateful and small. Vanessa stepped forward, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Her face was twisted in a nasty, condescending sneer. "You really are pathetic, Morgan," she spat. "You have always been so desperately jealous of me and Preston. You could not just let us have a peaceful morning. You had to hire some random old actor or sugar daddy to walk you down the aisle because you are furious that Preston comes from actual generational wealth, while you are just an ungrateful charity case our parents took pity on." Vanessa took another step closer, looking me up and down with absolute disgust, her eyes raking over my custom gown. She criticized my hair, telling me the natural style I wore was unprofessional and entirely inappropriate for a high society wedding. She told me my dress looked like a cheap imitation of luxury that I probably bought off the rack in some discount bridal shop in New York. She sneered that Julian was probably only marrying me because he felt sorry for a lonely, low-level corporate drone who had no real family connections. "You are a complete embarrassment to this family," Vanessa continued, her voice rising in pitch and dripping with venom. "Our parents gave you absolutely everything, and you repay them by staging this cheap theatrical stunt just to ruin my mood. You will never be on my level, Morgan. You will never have the class, the money, or the respect that I naturally possess." They stood there panting slightly, waiting eagerly for my reaction. They were waiting for the familiar emotional breakdown. They wanted me to collapse onto the plush hotel sofa, sobbing and begging for their forgiveness. They wanted me to apologize for ruining Vanessa's precious feelings, and to promise that I would publicly apologize to Warren during the dinner toasts. They needed to see me broken so they could feel powerful again. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath. The scent of my expensive floral perfume filled the air between us. I reached down and calmly smoothed out a tiny, invisible wrinkle on the skirt of my ivory silk gown. The stinging on my cheek was already fading into a dull throb that I barely even registered. The physical pain meant absolutely nothing to me now. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and then shifted my gaze to Vanessa. My voice, when I finally spoke, was completely devoid of emotion. It was the cold, calculated voice of a Wall Street executive who was about to execute a flawless, hostile takeover. "Are you two quite finished?" I asked softly, my tone completely flat. Brenda blinked in confusion, visibly taken aback by my freezing demeanor. Vanessa uncrossed her arms, her arrogant sneer faltering for just a fraction of a second as she tried to process my lack of tears. I reached up and delicately adjusted my diamond earring, making sure it was perfectly aligned, catching the light from the small chandelier above us. "If you are finished screaming your insecurities at me," I said, maintaining intense, unbroken eye contact, "I highly suggest you go out there and enjoy the open bar. You should probably drink as much expensive vintage champagne as you possibly can tonight. Take lots of pictures, too. Because after tonight, neither of you will ever be able to afford a single glass of it ever again." My mother opened her mouth to yell another insult, but the pure, cold authority radiating from my posture completely silenced her. She took a small, unconscious step backward, suddenly intimidated by the daughter she thought she controlled. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, her face reddening with fresh anger, but I simply turned my back on them, I reached for the heavy brass lock, turned it with a loud metallic click, and pulled the door wide open. The joyful, loud sounds of the wedding reception flooded back into the room, instantly drowning out their toxic, suffocating presence. I walked out into the brightly lit hallway, leaving them standing alone in the quiet holding room, confused, angry, and completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was waiting for them on the other side of the ballroom doors. I walked back into the grand ballroom, taking a deep, calming breath. Julian was waiting for me near the massive floral archway at the center of the room. He handed me a glass of sparkling water and wrapped his arms securely around my waist. I looked across the room and saw Calvin seated at the best table right near the front stage, deep in conversation with the chief of police, who happened to be one of his oldest friends. Everything was perfectly in place. The guests were laughing and enjoying the lavish spread of caviar and roasted duck. It was a beautiful celebration, but the peace only lasted for a few minutes. The heavy wooden doors of the holding room burst open, and Vanessa marched out with my mother close behind her. Vanessa's face was flushed red with anger, but she quickly plastered on a bright fake smile as soon as she saw the photographers. She smoothed down her inappropriate white silk dress and scanned the room. Her eyes locked onto the stage where the DJ was setting up for the first dance. I felt Julian tense beside me as we watched Vanessa purposefully stride across the dance floor. She did not even stop to congratulate us or speak to the guests. She walked straight up the short stairs to the stage. The DJ, a professional who had been explicitly instructed about the schedule, looked confused as Vanessa approached his booth. Before he could even ask what she needed, Vanessa reached over and aggressively snatched the wireless microphone right out of his hand. She stepped to the center of the stage, tapping the microphone loudly. The harsh thumping sound echoed through the massive ballroom, cutting right through the smooth jazz music. The guests slowly stopped talking and turned their attention to the stage. People looked confused, wondering why the sister of the bride was interrupting the dinner service before the official toasts had even begun. Vanessa smiled broadly, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "Hello, everyone," she announced, her voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I know we are all here to celebrate little Morgan today. It is so sweet to finally see her settle down. But as the older sister, I felt it was my absolute duty to get up here and say a few words about family legacy and what it truly means to build a future." I stood perfectly still watching her. Julian whispered in my ear, asking if I wanted him to have the hotel security remove her. I shook my head slightly. I wanted her to speak. I wanted her to dig the hole as deep as humanly possible. Vanessa paced across the stage, loving the attention of the 300 elite guests. "You know, Morgan has always struggled to find her place." Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "She always wanted to be just like me and Preston. And honestly, who could blame her? Preston comes from a long line of distinguished old money. His family helped build this country. They understand generational wealth in a way that most people in this room can only dream of. It is a heavy burden to carry such a prestigious legacy, but Preston and I handle it with grace." I glanced over at Preston. He was sitting at my parents' table, staring at his wife with a look of absolute sheer terror. His face was covered in a thick layer of sweat, and his hands were trembling so violently that he had knocked over his water glass. The ice cubes were melting onto the expensive linen tablecloth, but he did not even notice. He kept looking back and forth between Vanessa on the stage and Calvin, who was sitting just a few tables away, sipping a dark liquor with quiet amusement. Preston knew exactly who Calvin was, and he knew that every single word coming out of Vanessa's mouth was sealing his financial coffin. But Vanessa was completely oblivious to her husband's panic. She was too busy living in her own arrogant fantasy. In fact, Vanessa projected her voice even louder. "I have a very special announcement to make tonight. Preston and I did not want to overshadow Morgan's cute little wedding, but since we are all gathered here, it just feels like the perfect time to share our own blessings. Preston and I are officially breaking ground on our new custom-built mansion in Buckhead next week." A scattered, polite applause rippled through the room from my mother's country club friends. Brenda clapped the loudest, beaming with pride at her golden child. It is going to be a $5 million estate, Vanessa bragged, leaning into the microphone. 12 bedrooms, imported Italian marble floors, a private tennis court, and a climate-controlled wine cellar for Preston's vintage collection. We are hiring the most exclusive architectural firm in Atlanta to design it. It takes a very special kind of success to build a dream like that at our age. But when you are married to a man with Preston's incredible pedigree, these things just come naturally. Vanessa paced back and forth across the stage, soaking in the spotlight. She started describing the architecture of the fake house in excruciating detail. She talked about the massive infinity pool that would overlook the city skyline and the custom-built garage that would house Preston's luxury sports cars. She even mentioned that they were importing rare stone from Greece for the kitchen countertops. She went on, spinning a web of absolute lies that she had somehow convinced herself was the truth. She was deeply addicted to the image of being rich, and she did not care how many debts her husband had to forge to maintain that illusion. My mother Brenda was practically glowing with pride. She nodded along with every word Vanessa said, looking around at her church friends to make sure they were sufficiently impressed. Brenda had always valued material wealth over any actual human connection. She saw Vanessa's speech as a personal victory, as proof that she had raised a superior daughter who married into the right kind of white elite society. Brenda even yelled out a supportive phrase from her table, encouraging Vanessa to keep bragging. The contrast between my mother's beaming face and my father's terrified silence was incredibly stark. Warren had not moved an inch since he sat down at the table. He was staring blankly at his empty dinner plate, completely traumatized by what Calvin had whispered to him at the church. Warren knew the money was gone. He knew the logistics empire was gone. But he was too paralyzed by fear and shame to stop Vanessa from making a complete fool of herself on stage. I hope one day Morgan can experience even a fraction of the success Preston and I have. Vanessa said, her tone dripping with extreme condescension. Maybe Preston can give your new husband some tips on how to invest in real estate. Because let us be honest, building a real empire takes a lot more than just a pretty dress and a church ceremony. It takes real money, it takes class, and it takes a bloodline of true winners. So let us all raise a glass to the future, to my new estate, and to keeping the family legacy alive and wealthy. She raised her empty hand in the air, pretending to hold a glass. A few people raised their drinks, but most of the guests just exchanged highly uncomfortable glances. The microaggressions and the blatant narcissism were too obvious, even for the most polite socialites in the room. They could feel the toxic energy radiating off the stage. Preston looked like he was about to physically vomit. He grabbed a cloth napkin and wiped the pouring sweat from his forehead. He tried to stand up to stop her, but his legs simply gave out and he slumped back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He knew there was no $5 million mansion. He knew there was no vintage wine collection. He knew his accounts were completely overdrawn, and that the man who held the deeds to his miserable life was sitting right across the room, watching the entire pathetic display. Vanessa lowered the microphone, looking extremely satisfied with herself. She truly believed she had just delivered the ultimate crushing blow. She thought she had successfully reminded everyone that she was the absolute queen of the family, and that I was just a pathetic peasant allowed to exist in her shadow. She smirked at me, waiting for me to run out of the room in tears. Julian stood calmly by my side. He leaned in and whispered that Preston's offshore accounts had just officially hit a negative balance of $3 million. Julian had been receiving silent updates on his phone throughout the entire evening. The timing could not have been more perfect. Vanessa was on stage bragging about a $5 million house while her husband was literally sinking into a multi-million-dollar black hole of debt. I did not run. I slowly let go of Julian's hand. I smoothed down the front of my silk dress and began walking directly toward the center of the dance floor. The crowd parted for me, their eyes wide with anticipation. The heavy silence stretched tight like a wire about to snap. I walked straight toward the stage, my eyes locked directly onto Vanessa's arrogant face. It was time to end the show. I kept my eyes locked on Vanessa's face as I crossed the polished mahogany dance floor. The rustle of my heavy silk gown was the only sound I made, but the sheer intensity of my gaze caused the guest to literally step back and make a clear path for me. Women in expensive designer dresses and men in custom-tailored tuxedos naturally parted like the Red Sea. Vanessa stood on the stage, her empty hand still raised in the air for her fake toast, basking in what she thought was her ultimate moment of triumph. She looked down at me with a sickeningly sweet, predatory smile, expecting me to grab a champagne flute and submit to her public humiliation. She thought I was walking up there to swallow my pride and congratulate her. I did not look at my sister. Instead, I turned my attention to the DJ booth located just to the right of the elevated stage. I caught the DJ's eye. He was a young, highly recommended professional who had been hired by Julian specifically for his ability to follow strict confidential instructions. We had paid him a very generous bonus to ignore anyone else who tried to take control of the audio-visual equipment tonight. I gave him a single, sharp nod of my head. The DJ immediately hit a heavy switch on his soundboard. Vanessa's wireless microphone let out a sudden, sharp electronic screech before going completely dead. The harsh feedback made several guests wince and cover their ears. Vanessa tapped the metal grill of the microphone, looking extremely annoyed. She opened her mouth to yell at the DJ to fix the volume, but before she could speak, the massive crystal chandeliers above us suddenly dimmed, casting the entire luxurious room into a dramatic low light. I walked up the short wooden stairs to the stage. I did not snatch the dead microphone from Vanessa's hand. I did not even acknowledge her presence as I walked right past her. I simply walked over to the heavy acrylic podium where a secondary wired microphone was securely set up for the official dinner toasts. I adjusted the flexible neck of the microphone, bringing it perfectly close to my mouth. The silence in the massive ballroom was so absolute you could hear the ice clinking in the water glasses. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said, my voice echoing clearly and powerfully through the silent room. The state-of-the-art sound system amplified my words, wrapping around every single guest. The people who had been exchanging awkward, judgmental glances just moments before now turned their complete, undivided attention to me. My tone was not angry. It was not shaking with tears. It was terrifyingly calm and entirely in control. "Thank you for taking the time to bless my wedding reception with your incredible announcement." Vanessa crossed her arms, her face twisting into an ugly defensive scowl. She did not like that I was not crying. She hated that my voice sounded so incredibly steady. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, the heavy white silk of her inappropriate dress rustling loudly in the quiet space. "It is truly inspiring to hear about the massive $5 million estate you and Preston are building in the heart of Buckhead." I continued, looking out at the sea of wealthy faces. 12 luxurious bedrooms, imported Italian marble floors, a climate-controlled wine cellar for a rare vintage collection. It paints such a vivid, beautiful picture of success and generational wealth. My mother, Brenda, who was sitting at the front VIP table, nodded vigorously, completely missing the highly dangerous undertone in my voice. She actually thought I was publicly admitting defeat. She smiled smugly at her wealthy church friends, proud that her golden child had successfully dominated the evening. But Preston knew better. From the corner of my eye, I could see Preston physically trying to sink lower into his velvet chair. His face was completely ashen, matching the exact color of his stark white dinner shirt. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging me to stop. He reached out with a violently trembling hand and gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. But mercy was not on the menu tonight. Before we all raise a glass to celebrate Preston's incredible financial pedigree and Vanessa's beautiful new dream home, I think it is only fair that we take a much closer look at what that legacy actually looks like on paper, I announced. I reached into the hidden seamless pocket of my custom silk gown and pulled out a small black remote control. I pressed the center button. Above the stage, directly behind where Vanessa was standing, A massive motorized projector screen began to slowly unroll from the ceiling. The mechanical hum of the screen lowering echoed loudly in the quiet ballroom. It was a massive cinematic screen designed for high-end corporate presentations. Vanessa turned around to look at the blank white canvas, a confused, highly irritated expression washing over her carefully contoured face. She assumed I was going to play a childish slideshow of embarrassing childhood photos, or perhaps a sappy romantic video to try and steal the attention back to my marriage. She truly had no idea what kind of corporate war she had just blindly walked into. At the back of the room, Julian stepped up to the audio-visual control table. He had his sleek silver laptop open and ready. He plugged a secure encrypted flash drive into the main port. The powerful high-definition projector mounted on the ceiling hummed to life, casting a blinding white rectangular light directly onto the massive screen behind my sister. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, leaning closer to the microphone, my voice dropping to a serious, commanding register. "My family has spent the last 2 decades absolutely obsessing over appearances. They have sacrificed every ounce of basic human decency and loyalty just to maintain the fragile illusion of absolute superiority. They love to talk about old money, exclusive real estate, and untouchable pedigrees. So tonight, I decided to give them exactly what they want: a completely transparent, unfiltered look at their precious financial empire." Calvin, who was sitting perfectly still at his table, took a slow, deliberate sip of his dark liquor. He did not take his eyes off my father, Warren, who was now hyperventilating quietly in his seat. I turned to look directly at Vanessa, who was now visibly panicking, squinting in the bright, stark light of the projector. Her arrogant smile was completely gone, replaced by deep confusion and a rising sense of dread. I gave her the exact same condescending, pitying smile she had given me my entire life. "Please direct your attention to the screen," I said softly but firmly into the microphone. "Let us see exactly how much that $5 million Buckhead mansion is really worth." Julian pressed a single key on his sleek laptop. The high-definition projector above us flashed brightly, and the first document appeared on the massive screen behind my sister. It was not an architectural blueprint for a sprawling estate. It was not a deed to a new property in an exclusive neighborhood. It was a glaring red eviction notice. I let the document sit on the screen for a full 15 seconds, letting the heavy reality sink in for the 300 elite guests staring up at it. The address printed clearly on the legal notice was Vanessa and Preston's current luxury penthouse apartment in Midtown Atlanta. The bold black text explicitly stated that they were 4 months behind on their massive rent payments and had exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises before armed law enforcement officers would arrive to physically remove their belongings. Vanessa turned around slowly, her heavy white silk dress twisting awkwardly around her ankles. She squinted at the bright screen, her eyes darting frantically back and forth across the dense legal jargon. Her jaw dropped completely open. She looked at the date printed at the top. She looked at Preston's distinct signature at the bottom, acknowledging the official receipt of the final warning. "Preston, what is this?" she whispered loudly, her voice trembling and completely stripped of its previous arrogance. I did not give him a chance to answer. I stepped closer to the microphone. "It appears the exclusive architectural firm has a very strange way of designing a $5 million mansion," I said, my voice echoing smoothly through the silent ballroom. "Or perhaps Preston simply forgot to mention that before you break ground on a new luxury estate, you usually need to pay the rent on your current apartment so you do not end up homeless by Tuesday." A low collective murmur spread instantly through the grand ballroom. The wealthy socialites and corporate executives shifted in their seats, leaning in closer to get a better look at the screen. My mother, Brenda, half stood from her chair at the VIP table, her face twisting into a mask of pure confusion and rising panic. She looked directly at Preston, demanding a silent explanation, but Preston was completely frozen. He was staring down at his empty dinner plate, his face dripping with cold sweat, looking like a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. I nodded to Julian again. The screen transitioned seamlessly to a series of highly detailed banking statements. The account name at the very top belonged to Vanessa's private trust fund. This was the massive fund my father Warren had established for his golden child years ago, to ensure she never had to struggle a single day in her life. The starting balance listed from 18 months ago was $1.2 million. The current available balance, printed in bold red ink, was exactly zero. "As you can all clearly see," I announced, projecting my voice effortlessly over the whispering crowd, "Preston's incredible old money pedigree is a truly fascinating concept. It is so fascinating that he had to secretly drain his wife's entire trust fund just to keep up the pathetic charade. Over the past year and a half, Preston has successfully transferred over $1 million out of Vanessa's accounts into offshore holding companies." Vanessa gripped the edge of the acrylic podium so hard her knuckles turned stark white. "You are lying," she screamed at me, her voice echoing shrilly without the microphone. "You forged these documents, Morgan. Preston is a real estate investor. He moved that money to secure a massive commercial portfolio. He told me the funds were tied up in escrow." I actually let out a soft, dry laugh. I looked at my older sister with genuine, profound pity. "A commercial portfolio in Las Vegas?" "Vanessa," I asked, tilting my head slightly. Julian pressed another button. The screen instantly filled with dozens of wire transfer receipts. They were not linked to construction firms or property management groups. They were directly linked to 3 of the largest high-roller casinos on the Vegas Strip. I read the names of the casinos aloud, letting the words hang in the heavy air. "Preston did not invest your money, Vanessa," I said coldly. "He gambled it away. Every single penny of it. He has a catastrophic gambling addiction. He lost your entire financial future playing high-stakes baccarat and blackjack while you were busy shopping for designer clothes on Rodeo Drive. All those times he told you he was flying to Chicago for critical board meetings. The flight records, right there on the screen, show he was actually flying first class to McCarran International Airport. He stayed in the presidential suite at the Bellagio, and he paid for it with your money." The crowd was now completely dead silent, hanging on to my every word. The country club elites who had just politely applauded Vanessa's arrogant speech were now staring at her with naked disgust and secondhand embarrassment. People were discreetly pulling out their phones to text the unbelievable gossip to everyone they knew. Vanessa looked as though she had been physically struck. She stumbled back a step away from the podium, shaking her head in complete denial. She looked at Preston, but he could not even make eye contact with her. He was completely broken. I decided it was time to deliver the final humiliating blow to Preston's fake billionaire image. I gave Julian one last nod. The projector switched to the final document for this segment. It was a standard commercial rental agreement from a local exotic car dealership. "By the way," I said casually, gesturing toward the glowing screen behind Vanessa, "that beautiful vintage Porsche 911 that Preston parked right in front of the main hotel entrance tonight. The one he specifically tipped the valet to keep parked in the VIP circle, so all of you could admire his incredible taste and wealth as you walked inside. It is a short-term daily rental from Exotic Motors of Atlanta. And according to the invoice displayed behind my sister, his credit card was actually declined twice for the basic security deposit before he finally managed to scrounge up enough cash to rent it for exactly 6 hours. He has to return it by midnight tonight, or the dealership is going to report it stolen to the police." My mother Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp from her table. She had spent the entire cocktail hour bragging to her church committee friends about that exact car, claiming it was a rare family heirloom passed down from Preston's grandfather. Hearing that it was a cheap hourly rental rented with a declined credit card completely shattered her social standing in an instant. I could see her friends physically leaning away from her, whispering fiercely behind their hands. Brenda's face flushed a deep, dark red. The embarrassment was physically choking her. Preston finally moved. He pushed his chair back roughly, the metal legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. He tried to stand up, perhaps to run out of the nearest exit, but his legs simply could not support him. He fell back heavily into his seat, pulling at the collar of his expensive rented tuxedo shirt, as if he could not pull enough oxygen into his lungs. He was a fraud, and every single person in the room now knew it. Vanessa looked from the screen to me and then down to her husband. Her perfect fake life was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. She had worn a white bridal dress to my wedding to prove she was better than me. But now she was just a broke, soon-to-be homeless woman standing on a stage with a dead microphone. And the best part was that I was not even remotely finished with them yet. Vanessa stared at the massive projector screen for another long moment before she slowly turned her head to look down at her husband. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolutely suffocating. Nobody dared to speak a single word. Everybody was waiting to see what the golden child would do now that her perfect reality had been ripped apart in front of 300 elite guests. "Preston," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of blind rage and total disbelief, "tell them she is lying. Tell them right now that you did not gamble away my entire trust fund on blackjack. Tell them that the $5 million mansion in Buckhead is real and that you actually own that car." Preston slowly lifted his heavy head from his hands. His expensive rented tuxedo shirt was completely drenched in cold sweat, and his pale face was twisted in an ugly expression of pure desperation. He looked around the massive luxury room, seeing the disgusted faces of the wealthy socialites he had spent years desperately trying to impress. He looked at Calvin, who was still calmly sipping his dark liquor at the front table. Then Preston looked up at his wife standing on the stage. He did not apologize to her. He did not beg for her forgiveness or try to make excuses. Instead, something deep inside of Preston completely snapped. The terrified, cornered animal suddenly turned vicious. "It is your fault!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking loudly and echoing across the silent ballroom. The sudden explosion of raw sound made several older guests jump in their seats. Preston stood up so violently that his heavy velvet dining chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the polished mahogany floor. "It is all your fault, Vanessa. You and your insane psychotic obsession with being better than your sister. You drained my soul and you drained my bank accounts. You think I wanted to fly to Vegas and risk everything we had. I had to do it just to keep you in custom designer shoes and exclusive private club memberships." Vanessa stumbled back, clutching the heavy white silk of her completely inappropriate bridal dress. "You stole $1 million from my private trust fund," she shrieked, pointing a violently trembling finger down at him. "You are a criminal, Preston. You are a disgusting fraud. I married into old money. You promised me old money." But Preston stepped closer to the stage, pointing right back at her, his face red with manic anger. "Your trust fund was a complete joke," he yelled back. $1 million is absolutely nothing compared to the insane billionaire lifestyle you constantly demanded. You wanted to be untouchable, Vanessa. You wanted to be a high society queen, so you could constantly look down on Morgan and Julian and feed your pathetic ego. My family lost our generational wealth 20 years ago, but you refused to care. When I tried to tell you the truth, you threatened to leave me. You told me to fix it. You told me to make us look rich, or you would file for divorce and embarrass me. I took those toxic commercial loans for you. I went to the high-roller casinos to try and win back the money you carelessly blew on your ridiculous vanity projects." The elite guests watched in absolute shock as the pristine, perfect couple violently tore each other to pieces right in front of the head table. The carefully crafted illusion of their superior life was burning to ashes in real time. Vanessa let out a loud, furious scream and launched herself down the short wooden stairs toward Preston. She swung her hand and slapped him hard across the face. The sharp smack echoed loudly in the room. Preston grabbed her wrists, pushing her back roughly to defend himself. Vanessa stumbled backward into the VIP dinner table, knocking over a massive crystal vase full of white roses. Heavy cold water and scattered flowers spilled all over my mother Brenda's expensive silver beaded gown. Brenda jumped up out of her seat, screaming wildly at Preston to take his hands off her precious daughter. She tried to step between them, waving her heavy diamond rings directly in Preston's face. "How dare you speak to Vanessa like that?" Brenda yelled, her sophisticated country club persona completely gone. "You are nothing but a broke, pathetic con artist. My husband will absolutely destroy you for this. We will have you thrown in federal prison for stealing from our family. You ruined my daughter's life." Preston let out a harsh, hysterical laugh that sounded almost unhinged. He looked at my mother with absolute venom in his eyes. "Destroy me!" he mocked loudly, spitting the words at her. "Your husband cannot even save himself, Brenda. You think Warren is some brilliant, untouchable businessman. Warren is a desperate old fool who has been secretly mortgaging his own regional warehouses just to keep my creditors away. He did it so your precious church friends would not find out we were entirely broke. You are all completely fake. This whole family is a pathetic lie built on stolen money and fake prestige." My mother froze completely, her mouth hanging open. She looked over at Warren, who was still sitting frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the floor. Warren did not defend her honor. He did not stand up to defend Vanessa. He simply sat there looking like a broken, empty shell. Brenda finally realized that Preston was telling the absolute truth. She grabbed her chest, breathing heavily as the crushing reality of her ruined social status finally set in. Vanessa was now kneeling on the floor, sobbing hysterically, her white silk dress soaking up the spilled flower water and ruined duck from the table. Her makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. I stood quietly at the acrylic podium, watching the absolute destruction of my toxic family. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or sadness. For 29 years, they had emotionally abused me, isolated me, and treated me like I was an unwanted burden. They had constantly paraded their fake wealth and their perfect golden child in front of my face, demanding my total submission. And now, in less than 10 minutes, they had completely destroyed each other without me having to lift a single finger. They had done exactly what toxic people always do when their elaborate lies are finally exposed to the bright light of truth. They turned on each other like starving wolves fighting over scraps. The high society guests were pulling out their cell phones, secretly recording the massive meltdown to post on social media. The prestigious members of the church committee were whispering to each other in absolute horror, shaking their heads at Brenda's total public humiliation. But the chaos in the room was only the appetizer for the evening. Preston thought he had just ruined Vanessa's life, and Vanessa thought Preston was the only villain. My mother still desperately believed that even if Preston was a broke fraud, Warren still had his massive logistics empire to fall back on to save them. They still did not understand the true scale of the financial slaughter that had taken place today. They did not realize that Calvin and I already owned every single thing they thought was legally theirs. I looked to the back of the room at Julian, who gave me a slow, sharp nod. The ultimate checkmate was still waiting to be played. The chaotic spectacle on the ballroom floor had completely paralyzed the wealthy guests. Vanessa was still kneeling on the ruined carpet, weeping hysterically into her stained silk dress, while Preston sat slumped in his chair looking like a hollow shell. My mother Brenda was frantically fanning herself, trying to catch the eye of her church friends, but they were all intentionally looking away, absolutely disgusted by the public display of financial ruin. The perfectly curated image of my family was bleeding out on the mahogany floor. But there was still one person left who desperately believed he could salvage the burning ship. My father Warren finally moved. The sheer terror that had kept him frozen in his seat ever since Calvin whispered in his ear at the church was suddenly replaced by a massive, violent surge of defensive rage. Warren could not handle the humiliation. He could not accept that the elite members of Atlanta society were currently staring at him with pity and contempt. He pushed his heavy dining chair back so aggressively that it slammed into the table behind him. He stood up, his chest, heaving, his face turning a dangerous shade of dark purple. He aggressively buttoned his custom suit jacket, trying to project an air of absolute authority, but his hands were trembling uncontrollably. He did not march over to Preston to defend his own honor. He did not kneel down to comfort Vanessa. He knew deep down that everything Preston had just screamed was the absolute truth. Warren knew he could not attack Preston without exposing himself further, and he was absolutely terrified to even look in Calvin's direction. So like a true coward, Warren locked his furious eyes directly on me. I was the easy target. I had always been his favorite scapegoat. "Turn that screen off right now, Warren!" bellowed his deep voice, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at me as he stormed toward the front of the stage. "Turn it off, Morgan. This instant." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my hands resting calmly on the sides of the acrylic podium and looked down at him with an expression of mild boredom. Julian stood quietly at the back of the room, leaving the projector screen burning bright with Preston's rental car receipts. Warren stopped at the bottom of the short wooden stairs, breathing heavily. He turned to face the crowd of 300 elite guests, forcing a tight, extremely unnatural smile onto his face. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, trying to play the role of the calm, rational patriarch. "Ladies and gentlemen," Warren announced, his voice dripping with fake, apologetic warmth, "I am so incredibly sorry for this ridiculous theatrical display. As you can see, my son-in-law Preston has had far too much to drink tonight. He is under a massive amount of stress from his highly successful real estate ventures, and sadly, he has suffered a very public mental breakdown. Everything he just said about my finances is the paranoid rambling of an exhausted man. Please disregard this entire embarrassing scene." Nobody in the room believed him. The silence was deafening. A few people actually scoffed out loud. Warren could feel the room turning against him. His fake smile faltered, and the dark, angry color crept right back up his neck. He spun back around to face me, his eyes burning with pure venom. He realized he could not charm his way out of this disaster, so he resorted to his favorite weapon, which was extreme emotional abuse. "You did this," Warren hissed, taking a step up the stairs toward me. "You planned this entire sick stunt just to ruin your sister's special night. You have always been a deeply disturbed, jealous little girl, Morgan. You could never stand the fact that Vanessa is beautiful and successful. So you hired some cheap investigator to dig up Preston's personal struggles, and you wait until your own wedding day to humiliate your flesh and blood in front of the entire city. You are a complete sociopath." He was projecting his own narcissistic traits directly onto me. It was almost fascinating to watch a man who had spent 30 years lying and stealing call someone else a sociopath. I did not interrupt him. I let him yell, letting the microphone pick up every single toxic word he said. "I gave you everything," Warren screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "I pulled you out of the dirt. I paid for your expensive private schools. I put a roof over your head and fed you when you were nothing. And this is how you repay my generosity, by bringing a total stranger to walk you down the aisle and trying to tear down the family name. You are an ungrateful, toxic stain on this family, Morgan." He took another step up the stairs, standing just a few feet away from the podium. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he had done when I was a child. But I was not a child anymore, and I did not shrink back. I stood tall, making direct, unwavering eye contact with him. "You think you are so smart?" Warren sneered, pointing his finger right in my face. "You think exposing Preston makes you the winner today? Well, let me tell you something, little girl. Preston is just a minor disappointment, but I am a titan in this city. I built a massive logistics empire from absolutely nothing. My distribution centers cover the entire East Coast. My company is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I have real power, Morgan, power you will never even comprehend." He paused, breathing hard, looking out at the crowd to make sure everyone was listening to his grand declaration of wealth. Then he looked back at me with a sickeningly cruel smile. "I was going to leave you a small portion of my shares in the company." Warren lied loudly, making sure his voice carried to the back of the room. "I was going to make sure you were taken care of despite your endless flaws. But after this disgusting display of disrespect, you are entirely cut off. Do you hear me, Morgan? As of this exact second, you are completely disinherited. He slammed his heavy hand down on the edge of the acrylic podium, causing the microphone to pop loudly. I am calling my corporate attorneys first thing on Monday morning, Warren shouted triumphantly. I am legally stripping you of the family name. I am removing you from the trust. You will not get a single dime of my money. You will not get a single share of my logistics empire. Everything I own, every warehouse, every truck, every dollar will go directly to Vanessa. You will go back to New York, and you will live the rest of your miserable life as a broke nobody, while your sister inherits an absolute fortune. You are dead to me, Morgan. You are completely cut off. Warren stared at me, panting heavily, waiting for the devastating impact of his words to crush me. He expected me to gasp. He expected me to finally break down and beg for his financial mercy. He truly believed that the threat of losing an inheritance would bring me to my knees because money was the only thing he actually valued in the world. The grand ballroom was dead silent. The elite guests held their breath, waiting for my reaction. Vanessa even stopped sobbing for a moment, looking up from the floor with a glimmer of vicious hope in her tear-stained eyes. My mother, Brenda, finally smiled a genuine cruel smile, absolutely thrilled that my father had put me back in my place. I looked at Warren. I looked at his red, sweating face and his expensive tuxedo. And then for the first time all evening I smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was a slow, sharp, terrifying smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms comfortably on the podium. Julian stepped out from behind the audio-visual control table at the back of the room. He picked up his heavy leather briefcase and began walking very slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom, heading directly toward the stage. Calvin shifted in his seat at the VIP table, folding his hands neatly in front of him, watching my father with the cold, clinical interest of a man watching a bug walk into a trap. Warren's grand threat of disinheritance was the absolute perfect setup for the final slaughter. Warren frowned, deeply confused by my complete lack of fear. He looked at Julian walking toward the stage and then back at me. His fake confidence began to visibly fracture. "Disinherit me?" I asked softly, my voice echoing through the silent room like a razor blade. I tilted my head, looking at him with absolute pity. "Warren, you cannot disinherit me from an empire you no longer own." Julian's heavy footsteps stopped right at the base of the wooden stairs. He placed his leather briefcase on a small side table and calmly popped the brass locks open. It was time to show Warren exactly who owned his life. Julian did not say a single word as he opened his heavy leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks of the brass locks opening sounded like a judge slamming a heavy wooden gavel in a completely quiet courtroom. He reached inside the leather compartment and pulled out a thick, neatly bound stack of legal documents, along with a second encrypted flash drive. He walked over to the edge of the stage and handed the physical documents directly to Warren, who stared at them as if Julian had just handed him a live grenade. Then Julian walked back to the audio-visual control table and plugged the new flash drive into his laptop. The massive projector screen above the stage flickered for a brief second before completely changing the image. The humiliating receipts of Preston's rental car and casino debts vanished. In their place, a highly complex and devastatingly clear financial spreadsheet appeared on the bright screen. It was officially stamped with the seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Georgia. The title at the top of the document read, Chapter 11, Restructuring and Total Asset Liquidation. Right beneath that title in bold black letters was the exact name of my father's prestigious logistics empire. Warren stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked down at the physical papers in his trembling hands, and then back up at the projector. The thick, dark purple color that had flooded his face just moments ago completely drained away, leaving his skin looking sickly and hollow. "What is this?" Warren choked out, his voice barely a whisper. His grand, threatening posture had completely evaporated. He was no longer the arrogant patriarch threatening to cut me off and destroy my future. He was a terrified old man, looking at the absolute end of his entire reality. That is the reality of your immense power, Warren. I said, my voice smooth and entirely unbothered. I pointed to the glowing numbers on the screen. I told you to look closely. You just stood in front of all these elite guests and bragged about your massive distribution centers and your fleet of trucks. You threatened to take away my inheritance to punish me for not bowing down to Vanessa. But the absolute truth is, you have nothing left to give. Your company is entirely bankrupt. A loud, collective gasp rippled through the massive ballroom. The wealthy executives and country club members who had respected Warren for decades were now staring at the screen in absolute shock. The numbers displayed behind me did not lie. The red ink was everywhere, showing millions of dollars in negative balances. I leaned closer to the microphone, making sure every single person in the room could hear the exact details of his massive failure. For the past 5 years, Warren has been systematically destroying his own company, I announced clearly. He took out massive, high-interest toxic loans, using the primary regional warehouses as collateral. He did not use that money to expand the business or upgrade the trucking fleet or pay his hardworking employees. He used it to fund the elaborate, fake high society lives of his wife and his golden child. My mother Brenda gasped loudly, pressing both hands to her chest. She looked up at the screen and then glared at Warren. She had spent her entire adult life believing she was married to a billionaire titan of industry. She had treated everyone around her like garbage because she thought her wealth made her untouchable. I looked directly at my mother. "That massive diamond ring you are wearing right now. Brenda?" I said, pointing directly at her hand. "The one you constantly flaunt at your elite church committee meetings." Warren paid for that ring by secretly mortgaging the Charlotte distribution hub. And Vanessa, that $1 million trust fund that Preston just gambled away in Las Vegas. Warren funded that trust by quietly liquidating the employee pension funds and taking on predatory mezzanine debt. He bled his own company dry just to make sure you two could pretend to be royalty while real families lost their retirement savings. The silence in the room was now thick with absolute disgust. Stealing from employee pensions to buy diamonds and fund gambling habits was a line that even the most ruthless business people in the room found completely repulsive. The guests were shaking their heads, crossing their arms, and looking at Warren with pure contempt. Warren dropped the heavy stack of legal papers onto the floor. The pages scattered across the polished mahogany wood. He grabbed the edge of the stage, trying to keep his knees from buckling. "You cannot do this," he stammered, looking wildly between me and Julian. "You do not have the legal authority. I am the chief executive officer. I own the majority shares. I will call my lawyers on Monday morning, and I will have this entire fraudulent filing thrown out of federal court." I smiled a very cold, predatory smile. Julian simply adjusted his tie and pressed another button on his laptop. The screen shifted again, displaying a new legal document. It was a massive corporate debt acquisition contract, fully signed and notarized. "You do not have any lawyers left." "Warren," I said softly into the microphone, "your corporate legal team resigned on Friday afternoon when they realized your primary operating accounts were completely frozen. And you cannot have this thrown out of court because you no longer own the majority shares. Your high-interest loans defaulted. The bank sold your toxic debt to a private equity firm on Wall Street. That firm executed a hostile takeover early this morning. They seized every single asset you own." Warren was shaking his head back and forth violently, refusing to process the words coming out of my mouth. He looked out at the sea of faces, searching for a single sympathetic friend, but everyone was looking at him with extreme pity and revulsion. His empire was gone. His legacy was completely destroyed. He was standing in the middle of a luxury ballroom wearing an expensive custom tuxedo, but he was officially a penniless fraud. Brenda suddenly let out a loud, agonizing wail. It was not a cry of concern for her husband. It was a selfish, panicked scream. She suddenly realized that her exclusive country club memberships were gone. Her luxury cars would be repossessed by the bank. Her massive, sprawling estate was built on a foundation of toxic debt that had just completely collapsed. She ran toward Warren, hitting his chest with her fists. You lied to me, she screamed, hitting him over and over again. You told me we were wealthy. You told me we were better than everyone else in this city. You ruined my life, Warren. You completely ruined my life. Warren did not even try to stop her. He just stood there absorbing the physical blows, staring blankly at the scattered bankruptcy papers on the floor. Vanessa was still crying softly in the corner, holding her ruined white dress, and Preston had buried his head under his arms on the dining table. The flawless, powerful family that had tormented me for 29 years was now completely shattered, turning on each other in the most public and humiliating way possible. But the final piece of the puzzle had not yet been revealed. Warren still did not know exactly who had orchestrated his absolute financial downfall. He still did not know who owned the private equity firm that had just swallowed his entire life whole. I looked past Warren and made direct eye contact with Calvin, who was slowly standing up from his chair at the VIP table. It was time to introduce my father to the man he had tried to bury 30 years ago. The ballroom was completely silent, except for the soft sound of Calvin's leather shoes stepping deliberately across the polished mahogany floor. He bypassed the chaotic mess of my mother weeping and Preston hiding his face. Calvin walked directly up the short wooden stairs and stood right beside me at the acrylic podium. He did not look angry. He looked entirely at peace, like a man who had waited a lifetime to watch a specific tree bear fruit. Warren took a step backward, his eyes darting frantically between me and Calvin. He knew Calvin had whispered the threat at the church, but seeing him standing side by side with his daughter on a stage in front of everyone finally made the terrifying reality click into place. Before we conclude this evening, I said, leaning into the microphone, I realize that many of you in this room only know the version of me that my family created. For years, my mother and father have told their country club friends that I was a disappointment. They told everyone that I was a struggling data analyst, living in a tiny apartment in New York, barely making ends meet. They used my supposed failure to make Vanessa look even brighter. They loved the narrative of the poor, pathetic younger sister. I looked directly at my mother, Brenda, who had stopped hitting Warren, and was now staring up at me with smeared makeup. But like everything else in this family, that narrative was a complete lie. I continued, my voice projecting clearly over the silent crowd. I did not fail. When I left Atlanta, I went to Wall Street. I worked 100-hour weeks. I learned the intricate mechanics of corporate restructuring and hostile takeovers. And by the time I was 27 years old, I was named a senior partner at one of the most ruthless private equity firms in Manhattan. I am not a low-level data analyst. I am an apex predator in the financial world. And my firm specializes in acquiring toxic debt from negligent business owners. A shockwave rippled through the elite audience. The corporate executives in the room suddenly sat up straighter, looking at me with a completely new level of intense respect. I was not just a disgruntled daughter seeking petty revenge. I was a Wall Street titan who had systematically dismantled a massive logistics empire from the inside out. Warren's jaw trembled. You, he whispered, his voice cracking. You bought my debt. I did not buy it alone, I replied smoothly. I turned slightly, gesturing to the powerful man standing next to me. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to formally introduce you to the chairman of my private equity firm. But more importantly, I need to introduce him as the true original founder of the logistics company my father claims to have built. His name is Calvin. The confusion in the room was palpable. People looked at each other, whispering frantically. Warren had spent decades cultivating the myth that he started his trucking empire from a single rusty van. 30 years ago, Calvin built a revolutionary distribution network right here in Atlanta. I announced, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. He hired my father, Warren, as a junior accountant to manage the books. But Warren was greedy. Warren wanted the empire for himself, but he lacked the intelligence and the vision to build it. So Warren falsified financial records. He paid off key witnesses. He framed his own boss for massive corporate embezzlement and sent an innocent man to federal prison for 10 years just so he could steal the company out from under him. The gasp from the crowd this time was deafening. The church committee members literally covered their mouths in horror. Framing a black businessman and sending him to the federal prison system to steal his life was the ultimate unforgivable sin in this community. Warren's reputation did not just shatter, it was completely vaporized. He was no longer a failed businessman, he was a monster. Warren shook his head desperately, holding his hands up to the crowd. "It is a lie!" he shouted, his voice shrill and panicked. "She is making it up! He was a criminal. The courts convicted him." Calvin finally stepped forward, taking the microphone from my hand. His deep, resonant voice commanded absolute authority, instantly silencing Warren's pathetic protests. "The courts convicted me because you handed them forged ledgers," Warren Calvin said, his voice low and incredibly powerful. "You let me rot in a concrete cell while you slept in a mansion bought with my money. You took my life. So I spent the last 20 years rebuilding my wealth from absolutely nothing, just so I could buy yours. I watched you leverage my beautiful company into the ground to pay for your wife's diamonds and your daughter's fake real estate. You destroyed the legacy I built. So I bought every single note of your toxic debt." Calvin looked down at Warren with a cold, terrifying finality. "Morgan is the brilliant architect who executed the buyout." Calvin continued, his eyes scanning the horrified faces of my family. "She knows every single hidden account you have. She knows every offshore wire transfer your pathetic son-in-law made. We did not just bankrupt you, Warren. We legally seized everything. The federal bankruptcy court has already approved the asset transfer. As of this morning, I own the logistics company again. I own the distribution hubs. I own the trucks." Calvin paused, letting the silence stretch out before delivering the ultimate crushing blow. "And I also own the deed to your primary residence," Calvin said softly. "The bank foreclosed on your massive estate yesterday afternoon to cover your defaulted loans. We bought the property at auction. So when this lovely wedding reception is over, you and Brenda cannot go home. Your keys will not work. The security gates have already been recoded. You are entirely homeless." The absolute devastation in the room was physically heavy. Warren collapsed onto his knees. He actually fell to the polished wooden floor in his expensive tuxedo, clutching his chest as if he were having a massive heart attack. But it was not a heart attack. It was the crushing weight of absolute defeat. He had spent his entire life destroying other people to make himself look big, and now he had been completely erased by the daughter he threw away and the man he tried to bury. Brenda let out a horrifying, high-pitched scream. She dropped to the floor next to Warren, grabbing the lapels of his jacket, violently shaking him and screaming that he needed to fix it. Vanessa crawled over to them, her white silk dress completely ruined, sobbing uncontrollably as her entire universe collapsed. The perfect golden family was now just a pathetic pile of weeping frauds on the floor of a luxury hotel ballroom, and I stood above them feeling absolutely nothing but sweet, beautiful peace. I stood at the acrylic podium, looking down at the pathetic scene unfolding on the ballroom floor. Warren was still kneeling, clutching his chest, while my mother Brenda hysterically pounded her fists against his shoulders. They were completely broken, but I needed them to understand the exact mechanics of their destruction. I needed Warren to know exactly how his invisible daughter had completely dismantled his entire universe. I leaned back into the microphone. "You threatened to disinherit me, Warren," I said, my voice cutting through Brenda's loud sobbing. "You stood on this stage just a few minutes ago and told 300 people that you were going to cut me off and leave everything to Vanessa. But you cannot leave her a kingdom that you do not own. You have absolutely nothing left to give her." Warren slowly raised his head, looking up at me with hollow, bloodshot eyes. He looked like a man who had just been hit by a freight train, but I was not finished explaining the crash. "For the past 5 years, Calvin and I have been watching your every single financial move," I explained smoothly, pacing slightly across the stage. "Calvin provided the massive capital, and I provided the intimate knowledge of your reckless spending habits. Every time you went to a regional bank begging for a high-interest loan to cover your failing distribution centers, we were the ones waiting in the shadows. We created a network of anonymous shell companies on Wall Street. When traditional lenders refused to give you more money because your debt-to-income ratio was completely toxic, my shell company stepped in and bought your debt. The elite corporate executives in the crowd were nodding slowly, completely mesmerized by the sheer ruthless brilliance of the financial strategy. They understood exactly what I was describing. I was speaking their language. You thought you were outsmarting the banking system. Warren, I continued. You thought you found private lenders who did not care about your fraudulent bookkeeping, but it was just me. It was always me. I approved every single extension you asked for. I authorized every single cash bailout you needed to keep Brenda dripping in diamonds and to keep Vanessa living in her fake luxury bubble. I gave you just enough rope to hang yourself completely. And then yesterday morning, when your massive balloon payments finally came due, I simply pulled the rope tight. Calvin stood beside me, his arms crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of absolute dominance. He nodded in agreement, letting me deliver the final details of the execution. We did not just take the logistics company. I announced, my voice ringing with total authority. We took everything that was tied to it. And since you were stupid enough to use your personal assets as collateral to keep the business afloat, we own your personal life too. That sprawling $10 million estate in the exclusive suburbs. The deed is currently sitting in a vault at my firm in New York. The fleet of luxury cars sitting in your massive driveway, including Brenda's brand new imported SUV. Those titles were transferred to our holding company at exactly noon today. Brenda let out another agonizing scream, covering her ears as if blocking out the sound of my voice could somehow change the reality of her bankruptcy. She shook her head wildly, refusing to accept that her life as a high society queen was officially over. Even your exclusive country club memberships, I added, looking directly at my mother. Warren paid for those annual dues using the corporate expense accounts. Since the corporate accounts are now completely frozen and under federal bankruptcy review, your memberships have been permanently revoked. You are no longer welcome at the tennis courts or the charity galas. Your entire identity was built on stolen money, and now the money is completely gone. I looked back down at my father. He was trembling violently. The sheer scale of the hostile takeover was finally processing in his mind. He realized that he had spent years insulting and belittling the exact person who held the legal keys to his entire existence. You called me a charity case, I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. You called me a toxic stain on this family. You allowed Vanessa to treat me like garbage because you thought I was weak and useless. But the truth is, Warren, I have been the one feeding you for the last 5 years. I have been the one keeping a roof over your head. You were living on my charity. And today, the charity has officially run dry. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The raw display of power and consequence was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. Julian stood quietly at the back of the room, a proud, deeply satisfied smile on his handsome face. The projector screen behind me was still glowing brightly, casting a harsh white light over my ruined family kneeling on the floor. Vanessa suddenly looked up from her ruined white silk dress. Her face was a catastrophic mess of running mascara and deep red splotches. She looked at me with a desperate, pathetic expression. Morgan, she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the projector. Please, you cannot do this to us. We are your family. You are my sister. Please do not take our home. It was the very first time in my entire 29 years of life that Vanessa had ever said the word please to me. It was the first time she had ever acknowledged me as a sister instead of a punching bag. But her words meant absolutely nothing. They were just empty, desperate sounds coming from a narcissist who had finally run out of victims. I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of closure. Family is supposed to protect each other, Vanessa, I said softly. Family does not push you down and steal your light so they can shine brighter. You made your choices. You chose the fake mansions and the rented sports cars and the cruel jokes. You built your entire life on a foundation of lies. And now gravity has finally caught up with you. I walked back over to Calvin, who placed a warm, supportive hand on my shoulder. He looked down at Warren one last time. The man who had stolen 30 years of his life was now just a pathetic heap of ruined tuxedo fabric and shattered ego. Calvin did not need to say anything else. His mere presence had been enough to completely break the psychological hold Warren had over this entire city. The guests in the room were already mentally deleting Warren from their social circles. The elite business contacts who had happily drank his expensive champagne just an hour ago were already planning how to distance themselves from his toxic fallout. Warren was entirely isolated. Preston finally lifted his head from the dining table. His rented tuxedo was soaked in sweat and spilled water. He looked at the projector screen and then looked at me. He did not say a word. He just slowly stood up on shaky legs, pushed his chair in, and began walking toward the exit. He did not look at Vanessa. He did not look at my parents. He simply abandoned them, abandoning the sinking ship he had helped drill holes into. Vanessa screamed his name, but he just kept walking, his head down, a broken fraud disappearing into the hotel lobby. I watched him leave, feeling the last remaining tension drain from my body. The financial trap had sprung flawlessly. The checkmate was complete. The board had been completely flipped and the game was permanently over. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung shut behind Preston, leaving a permanent echoing thud in his wake. He was gone, and with him went the last tiny shred of dignity my family possessed. The silence that followed his exit was thick and suffocating, but it only lasted for a few seconds before the absolute reality of my words finally shattered my mother's mind. Brenda had spent her entire adult life carefully curating the persona of an untouchable high society matriarch. She believed her wealth made her a god among the church committee members and the country club elites. She had based her entire identity on the brands she wore, the cars she drove, and the square footage of her sprawling estate. Hearing that every single dollar was stolen and that she was currently homeless was simply too much for her fragile, narcissistic brain to process. She looked wildly around the room, searching for her closest friends from the church committee. She locked eyes with a woman who had been her exclusive tennis partner for 10 long years. Brenda reached her trembling hand out silently, begging for support. But the woman simply turned her head in absolute disgust and took a deliberate step backward, melting into the crowd. That single silent rejection broke something deep inside my mother. She finally realized that her elite social circle was entirely transactional. Without her fake wealth, she was completely worthless to them. Brenda let out a sound that I can only describe as a feral, animalistic shriek. It did not sound human. It echoed harshly off the massive crystal chandeliers and made several guests physically flinch. She scrambled across the polished mahogany floor on her hands and knees, completely disregarding the heavy silver beads ripping off her expensive designer gown. She lunged at Warren, who was still slumped on the floor, staring blankly at the scattered bankruptcy papers. Brenda grabbed the lapels of his custom tuxedo jacket and began violently shaking him back and forth. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails dug into his expensive fabric, tearing the silk lapels completely open. "You fix this, Warren!" she screamed, her voice cracking in a horrifying, desperate way. "You fix this right now, you pathetic old fool! You call the bank, you call the lawyers. You cannot do this to me. My friends are watching. The entire country club is watching. Tell them it is a mistake, Warren. Tell them we are rich." But Warren did not fight back. He did not even try to pry her hands off his ruined jacket. His eyes were completely glazed over. He started muttering incoherently to himself, shaking his head side to side. He mumbled something about the distribution centers and the regional trucking routes, as if he were still sitting in a corporate boardroom trying to negotiate a failing deal. He was completely detached from reality. His brain simply shut down rather than accept the magnitude of his absolute public failure. Brenda realized he was completely broken, and her panic escalated into pure, unhinged hysteria. She began hitting his chest with her closed fists, sobbing incredibly loudly. Her elaborate, elegant updo unraveled entirely, sending dark strands of hair falling wildly into her tear-streaked face. She rolled off him and literally collapsed onto her back on the ballroom floor. She started kicking her legs and screaming at the gold leaf ceiling like a toddler having a violent tantrum. She screamed about her luxury cars and her diamond rings, weeping bitterly over physical objects while her actual family lay in absolute ruins around her. A few feet away, Vanessa was having a meltdown of equal magnitude. Preston's quiet abandonment had been the final nail in her coffin. The beautiful, untouchable golden child was now a legally broke, abandoned fraud, wearing a destroyed white silk wedding dress. Vanessa began to violently tear at her own hair, pulling her expensive extensions out and throwing them onto the carpet. She pounded her fists against the floor, wailing uncontrollably. She looked up at the stage, her face a terrifying mask of smeared black mascara and pure, unadulterated hatred. "I will destroy you, Morgan." Vanessa shrieked, her voice entirely hoarse and ragged. "I will ruin your life. You took my husband. You took my money. You are a monster. You are a jealous, ugly monster, and I hate you." She tried to stand up to charge at the stage, but the heavy, wet silk of her dress tangled awkwardly around her ankles. She fell hard onto her stomach, sliding across the spilled water and crushed white roses from the dining table. She stayed there sobbing into the damp carpet, her fingers clawing desperately at the mahogany floor. She looked incredibly small and entirely pathetic. The 300 elite guests stood frozen in a wide circle around the chaotic spectacle. Nobody stepped forward to help them. Nobody offered a comforting hand or a kind word to the weeping women. These were the same wealthy socialites my parents had bent over backwards to impress for decades. They were the people my mother had valued far more than her own youngest daughter. But high society is incredibly brutal when the money suddenly disappears. The guests looked at my family like they were covered in a highly contagious disease. They whispered to each other in deeply disgusted tones. Several younger guests pulled out their expensive phones and began recording the humiliating meltdown, ensuring that the video would be sent to every single elite group chat in Atlanta before the night was even over. I stood quietly at the acrylic podium and watched the complete implosion of my abusers. I watched my mother thrashing on the floor in her ruined designer gown. I watched my father babbling mindlessly to a stack of bankruptcy papers. I watched my sister crawling in spilled flower water wearing the white dress she bought specifically to humiliate me on my wedding day. For 29 years, I had been terrified of these people. I had let them dictate my worth. I had cried in my pale blue bedroom, begging the universe to tell me why I was so inherently unlovable. I had allowed their cruel microaggressions to slowly chip away at my soul. But standing there in the bright white light of the projector screen, I realized they were never actually powerful. They were just incredibly weak, broken people hiding behind a massive mountain of stolen cash and fragile egos. Without the money, they were absolutely nothing. Julian walked over and stood right beside me on the stage. He did not gloat or smile. He simply reached out and took my hand, interlocking his fingers securely with mine. His grip was warm and grounding. Calvin stood on my other side, watching the total destruction with a calm, solemn expression. We were a unified front of absolute truth and devastating justice. The jazz band, which had stopped playing when Vanessa originally hijacked the microphone, remained completely silent. The only sounds in the massive luxury ballroom were the pathetic wails of my mother and sister, echoing endlessly off the high ceilings. The sharp contrast between the elegant surroundings and the grotesque human behavior on the floor was stark and cinematic. I did not feel the need to say another word to them. I had delivered the ultimate truth, and the truth had completely destroyed their fake reality. I reached up and calmly pressed the small button on the audio console to turn off the microphone. The soft click signaled the official end of my involvement with my toxic biological family. I looked at Julian and gave him a soft, tired smile, knowing the nightmare was finally over. The heavy double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom swung open for a third time. The elite crowd, which had been staring in morbid fascination at my ruined family, suddenly shifted their collective attention. A group of men in dark, crisp uniforms stepped into the lavishly decorated room. At the front of the group was a tall, imposing man wearing the highly decorated uniform of the Atlanta Chief of Police. Calvin had mentioned him earlier in the evening when they were casually sipping dark liquor at the VIP table. Chief Davis was a man of absolute integrity. 30 years ago, when my father first framed Calvin for embezzlement, Davis had been a rookie detective. He had always suspected that Warren's pristine financial ledgers were completely fabricated, but he lacked the power, the rank, and the concrete evidence to stop the corrupt conviction. Calvin and Davis had remained quiet friends over the decades, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to balance the scales. Today was that moment. The heavy rhythmic thud of the officer's boots on the polished mahogany floor cut sharply through the pathetic sound of my mother's weeping. The wealthy guests hastily backed away, pulling their expensive silk gowns and custom-tailored jackets out of the path of the approaching police. The officers marched with absolute purpose, directly toward the front of the room, where my father was still kneeling amidst the scattered bankruptcy documents. Warren looked up, his glazed eyes trying desperately to focus on the approaching uniforms. He blinked heavily, his brain struggling to comprehend this new immediate threat. Chief Davis stopped just a few feet away from Warren. He looked down at the broken patriarch with an expression of profound, deeply rooted disgust. Warren Davis said, his voice deep and echoing with the full, heavy weight of the law. "I have been waiting a very long time to have this conversation with you." Warren tried to scramble backward, but his legs were completely useless. He leaned heavily against the edge of the elevated stage, his ruined tuxedo jacket flapping open, exposing his sweat-stained shirt. Henry Warren stammered, using the chief's first name in a desperate, pathetic attempt to feign intimacy. "Henry, listen to me. This is all a massive misunderstanding. My daughter? She is confused. My accounts are perfectly fine. I can call my personal banker right now. I can make a massive donation to the Police Benevolent Fund. Just let me make one phone call and we can clear this up quietly." Chief Davis did not even blink at the pathetic attempt at bribery. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thickly folded legal warrant. "Warren, you are under arrest," Davis announced loudly, ensuring that every single high society guest in the room heard the exact charges. "You are being arrested for multiple counts of severe corporate fraud, interstate wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and the deliberate embezzlement of employee pension funds. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently raiding your corporate headquarters downtown as we speak. Your servers have been seized and your remaining bank accounts are locked by federal mandate." Brenda, who had been rolling on the floor, suddenly sat straight up. The word arrest seemed to finally pierce through her hysterical delusion. She scrambled toward the chief, grabbing desperately at his dark uniform pants. "No," she screamed, her voice completely raw and broken. "You cannot arrest him. We are prominent members of this community. We host the annual charity gala for the hospital. You cannot treat us like common street criminals. My friends are watching." Chief Davis gently but firmly stepped back, removing his leg from Brenda's frantic grasp. Two large uniformed officers stepped forward. They grabbed Warren by his shoulders and hauled him roughly to his feet. Warren let out a pathetic, high-pitched whining sound as they forcefully pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly in the quiet ballroom. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. Warren was wearing a custom-tailored $15,000 tuxedo, a crisp white shirt, and a heavy gold Rolex watch, but his hands were securely bound in cold, cheap metal. "You have the right to remain silent," Davis continued, reciting the Miranda rights with a slow, deliberate cadence. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Warren did not fight back. He did not shout his innocence anymore. He did not threaten to sue the police department. He just hung his head, his chin resting heavily on his chest, his shoulders slumped in total, absolute defeat. The arrogant man who had terrorized me my entire life, who had threatened to completely disinherit me just 20 minutes ago, was now a helpless prisoner standing in front of the entire city. "Take him out," Davis ordered the two officers, pointing toward the main exit. The officers turned Warren around and began walking him down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. This was the exact same path I had walked down in my beautiful wedding dress just an hour earlier, feeling victorious and free. But Warren's walk was a horrific parade of absolute public humiliation. The 300 elite guests watched in completely stunned, absolute silence. The prestigious country club executives, who used to play golf with him and praise his business acumen, turned their backs as he passed, actively refusing to make eye contact. The wealthy women who used to drink expensive vintage champagne with my mother whispered harshly to each other, covering their mouths in shock and disgust. Warren was forced to walk the entire length of the massive luxury room, with his head bowed, his hands cuffed behind his back, and his false legacy entirely destroyed. Vanessa was still kneeling on the floor, frozen in place, staring at her father being led away in handcuffs. She could not even scream anymore. The shock had completely paralyzed her vocal cords. She realized that there was no magical bailout coming. There was no hidden account that would save her from eviction. The patriarch of the family, the man who had enabled her horrible behavior for 3 decades, was going to federal prison. I stood on the stage holding Julian's warm hand, watching my father being led out the heavy double doors. Calvin stepped down from the stage and walked over to Chief Davis. The two older men shook hands firmly, a silent, deeply respectful acknowledgement of a 30-year-old wrong that had finally been made right. The grand ballroom doors closed shut behind Warren, leaving my mother and sister completely alone on the floor. The police had taken the patriarch, the money was entirely gone, and the fake empire was completely burnt to the ground. The toxic structure that had suffocated me for my entire life was finally completely demolished. The silence that hung over the ballroom after the police escorted my father away was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. My mother Brenda and my sister Vanessa were still on the floor of the Grand Hotel. They stared at the heavy wooden doors for a long time, as if expecting Warren to suddenly walk back through them and declare it was all a terrible practical joke. But the doors remained firmly shut. The reality of their absolute destitution was finally sinking into their bones. The elite guests who had stayed to watch the spectacle were now quietly making their way toward the exits. Nobody wanted to be associated with the family of a disgraced federal criminal. The social isolation was immediate and brutal. Brenda slowly turned her head and looked up at me. Her expensive silver gown was completely ruined, covered in spilled water and crushed rose petals. The heavy stage makeup she had carefully applied earlier was washed away by her hysterical tears, revealing the deep lines of a terrified aging woman who had just lost her entire identity. She pushed herself up onto her knees, holding her hands out toward me. Her fingers were trembling violently. "Morgan," she whimpered, her voice cracking and pathetic. "Morgan, please. You cannot just leave us here. You cannot take the house. Where are we supposed to go tonight? We do not have anywhere to go. I am your mother, Morgan. I gave you life. You have to help us." Vanessa, who had been completely paralyzed by Preston's abandonment, suddenly snapped out of her shock. She crawled across the wet carpet, dragging the heavy, ruined silk of her inappropriate white dress behind her. She grabbed the bottom edge of my custom gown, her hands gripping the fabric with desperate strength. "Please, Morgan," Vanessa begged, sobbing so hard she was gasping for air. "I am so sorry. I am sorry for everything I ever said to you. I am sorry I wore this dress today. Just please do not take my trust fund. Give me back a little bit of the money, just enough so I can get a hotel room." Preston took everything else. "I have absolutely nothing left. You are my sister. Blood is thicker than water." I looked down at the two women begging at my feet. For my entire life, I had craved their approval. I had wanted my mother to look at me with love, and my sister to treat me with basic respect. But staring at them now, I realized they were completely incapable of loving anyone. They were not apologizing for a lifetime of emotional abuse and cruel manipulation. They were only apologizing because they had lost their money. They were grieving their luxury cars and their country club memberships, not their relationship with me. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my wedding dress out of Vanessa's desperate grip. I took a deliberate step back, creating a clear physical boundary between my new life and their toxic ruin. Blood is not thicker than water, Vanessa, I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sympathy. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. You two spent 30 years treating me like an unwanted burden. You isolated me. You belittled me. You used my pain to make yourselves feel powerful. I shifted my gaze to my mother, who was still holding her trembling hands out to me. Yesterday morning, when I was standing in my bridal suite, my father called to tell me he was abandoning me on my wedding day. I said slowly, making sure she heard every single word. You took the phone from him, Brenda. You yelled at me for being selfish. You told me that maintaining Vanessa's fragile ego and protecting your elite social image was more important than my happiness. Do you remember exactly what you told me to do, Mother? Brenda stared at me, her eyes wide with mounting terror. She remembered the phone call. She remembered the cruel, dismissive tone she had used when she thought I was just a weak, helpless girl. You told me to just walk alone, I reminded her, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. You told me to walk alone because I was not important enough to stand beside. So now it is your turn, Mother. You and Vanessa can walk alone for the rest of your lives. I did not wait for her response. I did not want to hear another desperate, empty apology. I turned my back on them entirely. Julian placed his warm hand firmly on the small of my back, and Calvin walked securely by my side. We walked away from the acrylic podium, stepping off the stage, and heading toward the private side exit of the grand ballroom. The sound of Brenda's agonizing screams and Vanessa's pathetic sobbing echoed loudly behind us, but I did not turn around to look at them even once. The heavy side doors opened and closed behind us, instantly cutting off the noise of my ruined family. We stepped into the quiet carpeted hallway of the hotel, and for the first time in my life, I took a breath of perfectly clean, unburdened air. We took the private elevator down to the ground floor, where a sleek black town car was waiting for us. The driver opened the doors, and we slid into the quiet leather interior. The chaotic luxury of the Ritz-Carlton faded away as we drove through the brightly lit streets of downtown Atlanta. The heavy, suffocating tension in my chest was completely gone, replaced by a profound, deeply peaceful emptiness. The slate had been wiped perfectly clean. The town car pulled up to a beautiful, secluded botanical garden on the outskirts of the city. This was the real destination. The massive 300-person reception at the hotel had simply been a carefully constructed stage to execute the financial trap. Julian and I had secretly planned a secondary private reception here for the people who actually mattered. We walked through the wrought iron gates and stepped into a stunning glass conservatory filled with glowing fairy lights and lush green tropical plants. Soft acoustic music played in the background. There were no elite country club snobs or judgmental church committee members here. There were only 40 people in the room. They were my brilliant, fiercely loyal colleagues from Wall Street. They were Julian's warm, loving, extended family who immediately rushed over to pull me into genuine, tight embraces. And they were the close friends who had held my hand through the darkest moments of my life. Calvin walked over to the small bar and brought back 2 glasses of vintage champagne, handing one to me and one to Julian. He raised his glass with a warm, proud smile. "To the family we choose," he said simply. We clinked our glasses together and I took a slow sip. The champagne tasted like absolute freedom. As I looked around the beautiful, glowing room, watching my real friends laugh and celebrate my marriage, I realized the true meaning of generational wealth. My father thought wealth was measured by the size of his distribution centers and the brand of his luxury cars. He thought money could buy respect and erase his crimes. But true generational wealth is the legacy of healing. It is the courage to look at a cycle of toxic abuse and firmly decide that it ends with you. It is the strength to cut out the poison even when the poison shares your DNA. I had lost my biological parents and my sister today, but I had not lost my family. I was standing right in the middle of my family. I was surrounded by people who celebrated my intelligence, who protected my heart, and who loved me purely for who I was. Without demanding I shrink myself, to make them comfortable. The trauma my parents inflicted on me would never be passed down to my future children. The chain was permanently broken. Healing from a toxic family is not a beautiful cinematic process. It is ugly. It is painful. It requires you to grieve the parents you deserved, but never actually had. It requires you to stand your ground and enforce brutal boundaries against the people who demand your endless submission. But when you finally walk through that fire and leave them behind, the peace waiting for you on the other side is worth every single tear. Thank you for listening to my story today. It was a long, difficult journey, but standing up to my abusers was the most important thing I have ever done. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace? What was the final straw that made you walk away for good? Please let me know your experiences in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories about surviving toxic families and rebuilding your life on your own terms. Remember that you are never obligated to tolerate abuse just because it comes from blood. You deserve to be loved and respected, and you have the power to create a beautiful family of your own choosing. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next video.